Welcome. This is Craig Applegath, and this is the 21st Century Imperative Podcast, the podcast series that explores the insights and approaches of scientists, designers, planners, engineers, business entrepreneurs, and other successful change makers who are finding effective ways to meet the three critical challenges posed by the 21st Century Imperative. These are: how will we continue to live on our planet without destroying our biosphere? How will we repair and regenerate the environmental damage we have already caused? And how will we adapt to the escalating impacts of climate change? Each episode will feature an interview with an individual whom I think you will find not only inspiring, but also very relevant to helping you answer the question, what can I do to meet the challenges of the 21st Century Imperative? We've received many comments back from listeners suggesting that we do an episode that introduces this podcast series and that provides some context about its purpose. So although this is the 5th episode we produced, we have decided to number this episode 0 rather than episode 5 because really, as an introduction, it belongs at the beginning of the series. And instead of me simply doing a monologue about the podcast series, I thought it might be more fun to turn the tables on me and have me be the person interviewed. Luckily for us, Erin Masters, our wonderful assistant producer, has volunteered to be the interviewer. But before I turn it over to Erin, I should introduce her. After graduating from McGill University with a BA in English Literature, Erin returned to Toronto and began working in the film and television industry. After spending a few years in that industry and learning a thing or two about production, which is great for us, Erin is now pursuing a career in social work. So Erin, it's now your interview.
Thanks for the introduction, Craig. It's been a lot of fun working on this podcast. So as Craig said, I'm going to be asking him questions about this podcast, but also I'm going to explore some of his ideas about how we might be able to meet the challenges of the 21st Century Imperative. But before we dive into our interview, I think it's worth providing listeners with a brief biographical sketch of Craig's interesting career up to date. Craig is an architect, urban designer, and pioneer in the planning and design of zero-carbon buildings and campuses, urban resilience, and symbiotic regenerative cities. He is also a founding principal of Dialogue's Toronto studio and, of course, the host of the 21st Century Imperative podcast. Craig first trained as a biologist and then as an architect and urban designer, so it's not surprising that he is so passionate about finding planning and design solutions that make sense in a world challenged by climate change and environmental deterioration. Since graduating from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard with a Master's of Architecture and Urban Design, Craig has focused on designing and leading complex, sustainable planning and design projects. He is internationally recognized for his design and advocacy of zero-carbon buildings and regenerative symbiotic cities. Craig speaks about his research and design explorations at conferences and workshops around the world, was a founding board member of Sustainable Buildings Canada, and is a past president of the Ontario Association of Architects. Craig was made a Fellow of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada for his services to the profession of architecture, and an honorary member of the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects for his contribution to the profession of landscape architecture. So, it's clearly not hard to see how Craig found himself producing this podcast series. So Craig, great to have you as a guest on the 21st Century Imperative podcast.
Thanks very much, Erin, and thanks for doing double duty. You're really great as the assistant producer for this podcast, so thanks very much for volunteering to step in and be an interviewer. On my part, I think this will give me some empathy for my guests in future. It's interesting to be on the other side of the table.
So let's start with a question about your passion for solving environmental problems through architecture and urban design. Where does this passion come from?
Well, since as far back as I can remember, as a kid, I was passionate about making and designing things and fascinated by the natural world. I was extremely lucky because my uncle was a science teacher, and I spent many of my summers as a kid tromping around Northern Ontario forest with him and his daughters, learning all about forest ecosystems and the role that various plants and animals played in those ecosystems. The thing I really remember most about those outings was how my uncle refused to simply explain things to us, but instead he encouraged us to figure them out for ourselves by developing hypotheses and then proving them or not. He provided us with just enough clues to build a hypothesis so that we ourselves could figure it out. I think this early experience with the scientific method, or what I came to realize was the scientific method, instilled both a sense of wonder about the natural world as well as a deep love and respect for natural systems and the scientific method. I also had an amazing biology teacher in high school who continued to inspire my love of all things biological. By the way, this is Stan Choptianti, who we interviewed in episode 3, and who later became the mayor of St. Andrews, New Brunswick after he retired from his career as a biology professor. It's a great episode. So upon graduating from high school, I entered the science and biology program at the University of Toronto with the intention of pursuing a career as a biologist and academic. However, I found that as a study, biology didn't really satisfy my other passion for designing and making things. Also, I came to realize that what was really starting to fascinate me was the intersection of our built environment and natural systems, and how we could shape our built environment to be more effectively and, I guess, constructively integrated with those systems. So the more I explored opportunities to do this, the more I was drawn to architecture. So now, years later, I still find myself as interested in biology as architecture and urban design, and I'm finding that I'm more able, at least in the latter part of my career, to integrate these three passions in my work.
And so where does climate change fit into the story?
Well, it wasn't really until I was starting my career as an architect in the 90s that I really started to become aware of the significant threats posed by climate change. I had, of course, read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and the first edition of Limits of Growth by Meadows and Rander when I was studying biology at the U of T, so I was pretty well aware of the pressures our species was putting on our planet. I had also tangentially heard about the work of the UN's International Panel on Climate Change, formed in the late 80s, but it wasn't really until I heard the interview on CBC Radio's Ideas series with Professor James Lovelock that I really started to become interested in the problem and how my world of architectural design and urban design might intersect with it.
How and when did your interest turn into activism?
Well, I don't think I can point to any exact point where interest turned into real concern, but I do remember the moment that concern turned into an activist desire to be part of finding big picture solutions. In fact, I can remember it very clearly. For most of the 90s and the first years of the 21st century, I very consciously steered my architectural career towards sustainable green design projects and studies and so forth. On every project that I worked on, I looked for ways for our architecture and engineering teams to reduce the project's environmental footprint, especially its CO2 emissions. And just around the time that I joined Dialogue to get a Toronto studio going in 2003, I read George Monbiot's book, Heat. It's an absolutely brilliant book and did something that no other climate change-related book I had read had done before. It actually developed a set of integrated strategies to reduce the carbon emissions of England down to a sustainable 350 ppm level. That's a sustainable level for CO2 in the atmosphere, to prove that it could be done. Monbiot's method got me thinking about concrete planning and design strategies that could be deployed to reduce and even eliminate the carbon emissions of cities and whole regions. However, it was the very end of Monbiot's book that made me realize that I had to do more than simply design greener buildings with lower carbon footprints. I brought the book with me to the interview because I figured it would be worth quoting at some point. Let me read you what he says on the second last page of the book. He says, "But by itself, as I know to my cost, writing, reading, debate, and dissent change nothing. They are of value only if they inspire action." The point about action struck a chord. As I moved forward in preparing workshops and presentations about climate change and how we might deal with it, and now this podcast, I made a point of only speaking about practical actions that planners, architects, and engineers could deploy to reduce carbon emissions and deal with the impacts of climate change. Ringing alarm bells was not enough. Pragmatic strategies for actions were necessary. This led to speaking and planning at design conferences around the world and doing workshops to both raise awareness about how we need to design our cities to not only reduce the harm we are doing to our biosphere, but to also explore how we will adapt to climate change and repair the damage we've already done. More recently, as you know, I started this podcast as a way to get the key ideas of some of the most important thinkers and change agents out into the world, and without having to pay to go to a conference.
And why did you decide to use the medium of the podcast as a way to communicate your ideas?
Well, another sort of circuitous story. What became apparent over the last 4 or 5 years is I've been invited to speak at conferences and around the world. It's been a lot of fun, like speaking in China and Germany and the United States and so forth. But it became apparent that I was really very much speaking to the converted, like preaching to the choir. And so you'd be speaking to an audience of 200 or 300 people, but they were all architects and planners who were all doing green design. So it's like, well, we all got together and talked about various ways that we could improve how our designs were greener and caused less environmental harm. But it struck me that there had to be a way of getting the message out to a wider audience. And the other thing too was that when you give a presentation about, say, low carbon design or regenerative design, you get to use 2 or 3 examples, and each one of those examples you could spend an hour talking about, but your whole presentation is, the TED Talk 18 minutes or 25 minutes. So you end up skipping over a lot of really key ideas and concepts, and you don't have time to talk about them in any detail. So I found myself very frustrated that the standard venue of 25 minutes for a presentation only allowed you to very, very superficially cover some of the really interesting things that were going on. So that was the sort of thing at the back of my mind. And then my brother Stuart gave me a copy a year or so ago of Tim Ferriss's book, Tools of Titans. And the interesting thing about this book is it's a compilation of Tim Ferriss's podcasts. He's distilled each podcast into 2 or 3 pages of key ideas. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I started to go and listen to his podcast, and they were great because he would interview an individual whom he thought really made some difference in the world of either finance or academia or human health, and just sort of explored with them their ideas and how their ideas were going to make a difference. So I thought, well, that's a really good medium. The podcast is really a powerful tool because you actually have 45 minutes to an hour. People are often listening to podcasts as they drive in on their commute. So that's about the time of a commute for a lot of people, unfortunately, these days. So people are happy to listen to someone talking, a conversation for 45 minutes to an hour. And it meant that I could interview really interesting people that I thought were going to make a difference or were making a difference, and that their ideas could be explored in some detail. I mean, 45 minutes is lots of time to really dive into what someone is doing. And interestingly, Tim's podcast and how he did it was really not only inspiring as a method, but some of the techniques he used. And he's very generous as a podcaster and a teacher. In his book, The Tools of Titans, he actually has a chapter on doing podcasts, which of course I avidly read and consumed. And in fact, this podcast itself, its form and structure, owes a great deal to Tim's book and his podcast. And by the way, if any of you are a listener of Tim's podcast, then you'll recognize the format of some of the questions that I ask my guests. For example, the hypothetical questions at the end of our podcast were very much inspired by Tim's rapid fire questions. So Tim, if you ever happen to listen to this podcast, thanks very much for your inspiration and generosity of spirit. I very much appreciate what an excellent teacher you've been. Thanks very much.
So you've called this podcast the 21st Century Imperative. Can you take us through what exactly is the 21st Century Imperative?
The notion for the 21st Century Imperative originated out of a conversation I had about a year ago with Jeff Schnur. For those listeners that have just tuned into the series, Jeff is the guest of our first episode because he was the one that gave me the idea for the podcast. We were talking about the incredible environmental challenges that the world now faced and how I was planning to use this podcast to explore the three important climate challenges we face this century, which are, first, how we reduce the harm we are now causing, that is, how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Second, how we adapt to the impacts of climate change. And the third, how we repair the damage to the environment that we have already caused. At some point in the conversation, Jeff said, well, it's very clear that solving these three challenges are the imperative of the 21st century. As soon as he uttered that phrase, imperative of the 21st century, I knew that had to be the name of this podcast series.
What then is the purpose of this podcast? What do you hope to accomplish?
That's a great question. I've spent the last 10 years or so researching and exploring how architects and planners can best respond to the challenges associated with 21st century imperative. And I've had the opportunity to speak about these explorations at conferences around the world. One of the frustrations of presenting at these conferences has been that conference venues typically don't allow the kind of time required to have a thorough discussion of all of the challenges and the opportunities for dealing with the challenges. There are so many important ideas and stories to talk about that a 20-minute presentation just doesn't allow it to happen. So I figured that the podcast medium would allow me to get these stories and ideas out to the world in a much more effective way.
What does success look like to you for this podcast? How will you know when you're succeeding?
I've actually thought about this question quite a bit, Erin. First of all, success will definitely not be about monetizing the value of the content of this podcast series. This is very much a passion project for me. I have a great career as an architect and urban designer, and I'm also paid to give presentations around the world, so making money is not the goal of the podcast. Corny as it may sound, the real purpose of this podcast is to, in some small way, do my bit to contribute to meeting the challenges of the 21st century imperative. To some extent, I get to do this every day when I design buildings that don't emit carbon and work on campus master plans that reduce carbon and help regenerate ecosystems that they are part of and so forth. So for me, this podcast is all about providing a platform for people I really admire, people who have real insights and in many cases practical strategies and solutions to the challenges we now face. I therefore see my role as a conduit for these ideas to reach the ears of our listeners, who might then possibly be in a position to implement these ideas or maybe further build on them to create further new ideas. So I guess to answer your question, I see success in terms of connecting the dots. That is, connecting people with important insights and ideas to people who might be able to leverage those insights and ideas in their own spheres. So to your question, how will I know I'm succeeding? Well, I guess that's a much harder question to answer. I'm not sure there's any way to measure it exactly. One measure will be the number of people we can reach, but of course that will only tell us how many people have listened. I guess the really important thing is the ignition of new ideas in our listeners and the possibility that some of those listeners will be able to use those ideas to make a difference. But of course, that's something we'll never know for sure, I guess.
Going forward, what kinds of people do you plan to interview? And who makes a good interview candidate, in your opinion?
Typically, my criteria for asking someone if they'd like to be a guest on the podcast is pretty straightforward. First of all, the potential guest has to be doing something in their career or life that is making a material difference to helping us meet the challenges of the 21st century imperative. More specifically, they have to be doing something to help us reduce the harm we are causing, and or be doing something that helps us adapt to the impacts of climate change, and or doing something that helps us repair the damage we've already done or are doing to the environment, or some combination of these three. Second, they have to have a compelling story, something that would interest listeners. And third, they have to be good role models for listeners to identify with and be inspired by. I think now more than ever, we need inspiring role models. There are now so many people that occupy important positions that are just not offering any real inspiration, let alone good leadership.
Who is this podcast aimed at? Who will want to listen to this?
I guess very succinctly, this podcast is aimed at people who want to make a difference and who are looking for real-world insights and ideas about how they might do that. Typically, the people who I will be interviewing are going to be people who are talking about their particular approach or their experience with one or more of the challenges. So I think that listeners will be self-selecting based on what kinds of things they are interested in. So there's a range of people that are going to be interviewed. So I think as they look through the series of podcast listings, they'll end up clicking on the people that strike them as being interesting to their own world. For example, if I'm interviewing an urban planner who has significant expertise in planning sustainable cities, like Klaus Hoppe in episode 4, I think it will get picked up by urban planners who are looking to expand their own understanding of sustainable planning. Then again, listeners may be interested in a topic just generally or a broad range of topics. So I think it will be attractive to people that have very specific interests and people that are just generally interested in the issues associated with the 21st century imperative.
In addition to your practice as an architect and urban designer, you have also spent a fair bit of time speaking at green planning and design conferences around the world on these issues. So presumably you have your own ideas about how we will meet the challenges of the 21st century imperative. I'm thinking that it might be worth spending a bit of time talking about some of your own ideas and the conclusions you may have come to about what we need to do as a species to meet the challenges of the 21st century imperative. So let's start with the first challenge of reducing harm. What is the most important thing we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and in a time-effective way?
I think there are many things we can do, but I think there are 3 things at the top of my list we can do that will have the greatest impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The first, and I think probably the most important one, is urban density. Living in dense cities significantly reduces our per capita greenhouse gas footprint. As an example, if you live in the suburbs in Toronto, the average per capita CO2 emissions for you are somewhere in the order of 14 to 16 tons of CO2 per year. Whereas, if you live in the city's core, your per capita emissions are around 3 to 4 tons of CO2. That's a 75% reduction in emissions for the person living in a dense area. By the way, this logic holds for your total ecological footprint as well. I think the second thing is urban afforestation. Urban forests do a whole lot of work for us in sequestering carbon, but also in cooling our streets and helping us deal with stormwater, especially in heavy storms. They also add to our mental well-being because of our innate biophilia and positive response to trees. And the third one, I think, is carbon metabolization and storage. Now, this is a little bit more controversial, but I think it's an extremely important strategy for significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And it's actually a very cool and simple idea. It's the use of a highly innovative technology developed by Pond Technologies, a Canadian firm. So let me just paint a picture of how this technology works. First of all, imagine a large tank of water, about the size of a shipping container. Could be bigger or smaller depending on the load of CO2. And into this tank are inserted dozens of LED rods that allow the whole interior of the tank to be illuminated with intense LED light. Then, the flue gases of any fossil fuel burning system, for example, a natural gas-fired electrical generator, are pumped into the tank at the bottom of the tank and bubble through the tank water, sort of like a bubbler in an aquarium. Now here's the important part. Algae of different strains has been added to the water, and in the presence of light and CO2 and NOx and SOx, it will start to grow and multiply exponentially. This algae then metabolizes all of the greenhouse gases and stores them as algae biomass, which is very valuable and more than covers the cost of the process. So what this means, Erin, is that we now have a way of burning fossil fuels without releasing greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. If you use the biomass fuel source for electrical generation, then you can keep the carbon in a closed loop. The key thing here is that we need something to deal with fossil fuels until we can replace them with some combination of solar power and clean nuclear. This may be it. By the way, This will be the topic of an interview with Steve Martin, the CEO of Pond Technology, in an upcoming podcast.
What about the challenge of adapting to climate change? It's clear that climate change is already starting to bite. What are some of the key approaches we need to take in order to adapt?
This is a very interesting question. And I think instead of diving into it in this podcast, I'm going to suggest that listeners listen to podcast number 3, where I interview Stan Choptiani. Stan is a biologist who became the mayor of St. Andrews, New Brunswick, and helped that community develop a series of strategies for adapting to climate change. However, if you were to ask me if there was one strategy that any city should implement for climate adaptation, I would say it would be to plant more trees. The more, the better. Urban forests do so much work in helping deal with stormwater and keeping a city cool.
And lastly, the repair and regeneration of the environment that we have already harmed. What are some of the approaches we need to regenerate our biosphere?
Actually, the kind of things that make sense for adapting to the impacts of climate change also serve to regenerate the environmental damage we've already done. So in our first podcast interview with Jeff Schnur of Community Forest International, this is a really good example of how to repair a damaged ecology. Jeff talked about how on the island of Pemba, off of the coast of Tanzania, the islanders had over time used up their forest both as fuel wood and building materials. And it gone past the point of sustainable harvest. So there was a real problem with a damaged ecology. And he talked about how the communities, using a number of very simple methods, was able to repair and regenerate the ecology. And Jeff and Community Forest International assisted the communities on Pemba to plant over 1.5 million trees in the last 5 years. So really, really transforming the ecology and repairing the ecology of the island. So I think there's certainly opportunities for repair of damaged ecologies. I think one of the big challenges we're going to face is that not only are we trying to repair an existing ecology, but because the climate is changing and the environment for that ecology, therefore, is changing, then repairing it the way it was may not work. So we're going to have to be looking at novel ways to figure out how to maybe introduce new species from areas that are similar in the environment that's changing. I don't know. I think it's going to be one of the most challenging questions we face, but I think there's certainly strategies that we can explore.
Can you talk a bit about what you have done in your own architectural and urban design practice at Dialogue to address the 3 challenges of the 21st century imperative?
I've been very fortunate to be able to help build the Dialogue team of architects, planners, engineers, and interior designers since we started the studio in Toronto in 2003. One of the things that being part of starting the studio allowed me to do was to be one of the leaders and cheerleaders for designing very green buildings and master planning very green university campuses and communities. With most of the work I have done over the past 15 years, I've tried as much as possible to push the boundaries of sustainable design. As an example of a very green project, we just completed an exceptionally green building for the region of York in Ontario that was designed to meet both the LEED Platinum standard as well as all 7 petals of the Living Building Challenge. The building is called the Bill Fish Forest Stewardship and Education Center. Most significantly, this project is both a net zero energy and a net zero water project. And in addition, it is constructed of heavy timber, including glulam and CLT, and CLT stands for cross-laminated timber, so that it is not only very beautiful to be in, but locks up a significant amount of carbon in the wood. We've also recently started working with our college and university clients on how to plan low-carbon campuses. What we've done is created a low-carbon campus roadmap, which is a framework for them understanding how they can plan into the future with various capital and operating expenses in order to maximize the reduction of carbon as they go forward. I'll provide a PDF copy of this that can be attached to the blog.
You have also mentioned the enormous challenge of climate refugees in your interview with guests. as you discussed, this is a problem of catastrophic proportions. How do you think the world will come to terms with this problem?
I'm certainly not an expert on this problem, but I do think this is one of the most important and probably the most difficult challenges we face going forward. It will be the true test of whether we can bring the better side of our humanity to the fore and not let our more tribal and atavistic instincts rule us. I think for us here in Canada, we have a wonderful opportunity for Canada to be a place of landing for some number of these refugees. And Canada is now an underpopulated country and could certainly use a significant increase in our population. As Doug Saunders writes in his recent book, Maximum Canada, we should be aiming to increase our population to somewhere in the order of 100 million from its current 36 million. And part of that increase could easily come from resettlement of climate refugees. And I think we really have a moral responsibility to take that on as one of the things we can contribute to this, what will be a terrible, terrible humanitarian problem in the future. The UN predicts that by 2050, there will be 250 million climate refugees. And given the nature of UN calculations, they're somewhat political, so I suspect that's on the low side. So Canada is one of the countries that has an opportunity to really contribute, and I'm hoping that we can get there. Now, I'm fully aware of how controversial this idea is, but it's something that I think we need to have a serious conversation about, and soon.
What scares you the most about the climate change challenges we now face?
That's a great question, but I'm not sure that any one thing scares me the most. In fact, I think there are three things that compete for scaring me the most. The first thing that really scares me is the problem of complexity. Climate change is a super wicked problem, and I mean that in the actual definition of a super wicked problem. If you go to Wikipedia, you will see that a wicked problem is a problem defined by characteristics like the problem is not understood until after the formulation of a solution. Solutions to wicked problems are not right or wrong. Every wicked problem is essentially novel and unique. Every solution to a wicked problem is a one-shot operation. Wicked problems have no given alternative solutions. Now, a super wicked problem is a wicked problem with a few added extras, including time is running out, there is no central authority, those seeking to solve the problem are also causing it. That's very apparent in climate change. And policies discount future irrationality. All of this is a fancy way of saying that the intrinsically deep complexity and difficulties associated with the problem make it almost impossible to solve. I say almost because I'm a hopeful optimist. By the way, the super wicked problem of climate change sits beside and is related to a number of other super wicked problems, like population growth, other types of environmental degradation, like deforestation, overfishing, eutrophication caused by industrial farming, and industrial pollution. By the way, a related group of super wicked problems is termed a mess. Really, I'm not making it up. That's an official definition. The second thing that really scares me is willful blindness. One of the most interesting books I've read in a long time is Margaret Heffernan's book, Willful Blindness, Why We Ignore the Obvious at Our Peril. And we'll put a link to this book in our podcast for this episode. It's a fascinating read and very clearly makes the point that our brains are designed to tenaciously hold on to the ideas and beliefs we already hold, and to exclude any information or idea that does not support those beliefs. Literally, our brain goes to a great deal of biochemical effort to stop us from accepting ideas that are counter to what we already think. This obviously bodes ill for solving climate change. I have a feeling that the majority of people who do believe in climate change don't necessarily believe the consequences will be as bad as the climate scientists project. And the minority of people who don't believe in climate change will simply not change their minds, no matter what compelling facts are presented to them. So I really think we have quite an uphill battle to get people to buy into the significant efforts that will be required of us to deal with this super wicked problem. The third thing that really scares me is the combination of what is often referred to as lock-in or inertia, combined with what's termed hyperbolic discounting. Hyperbolic discounting, by the way, is the phenomena whereby we tend to discount the importance of problems that seem further away in time than those that are more immediate. These are all different aspects of the overall difficulty of making change happen. So put these together, and you have a super wicked problem that a great many people are willfully blind to, and even if they do believe it, because of lock-in and hyperbolic discounting, it is extremely difficult to get them to change course in order to address it.
Well, Craig, I must say you have made a very compelling case for why we will not be able to meet the challenges of the 21st century imperative. So I'm going to ask you to tell listeners whether or not you think we will actually be able to meet these challenges, and if so, how will we do it?
I'm not actually sure we will, in fact, be able to successfully meet the challenges of the 21st century imperative. The deck is truly stacked against us, or should I say, we have truly stacked the deck against ourselves. But one thing is for sure, if we don't try, then we will definitely not be successful. I actually don't think we have a choice but to try, really. And on the positive side, there are a number of cases in history when collective action to deal with worldwide threats, like serious threats, have actually worked. I think the best example is the catastrophic problem we created with chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. They created a huge hole in the ozone layer. That was, 30 years ago, that was a huge issue. And we really thought we're all going to fry from UV radiation as a result of this hole in the ozone layer, and it was getting bigger. So to make a long story short, governments were actually able to come together under the Montreal Protocol signed in 1987 and ban the use of chlorofluorocarbons. The ozone hole, as a result, is more or less been closed and is no longer a dangerous problem. And that was a huge issue, and people were really worried. So I think it's not impossible to take collective action as long as we can align interests. And I think that's the key thing. Now, granted, our world seems a lot more fractured than it did 30 years ago. But nevertheless, I actually think there are a number of real, economically viable approaches for meeting many of the challenges causing climate change, as well as the challenges posed by the impacts of climate change. And that's really the whole point of the podcast, is to get those ideas out into the world.
So would you say you're optimistic?
Well, this is one of the questions that I've been asking all of our podcast guests, so I guess it's only fair that I have to answer it too. Am I optimistic that we can meet the 21st century imperative challenges? One of my heroes, Václav Havel, a poet, playwright, and the former president of Czechoslovakia, was once asked by reporters if he was optimistic. And this is what he replied: "No, I'm not optimistic in the sense that I believe that everything will go well. But neither am I a pessimist in the sense that I believe everything will go wrong. I am hopeful, for without hope, there will be no progress. Hope is as important as life itself." This quote is very much one of my touchstones when I think about the huge challenges we face, because I really don't think giving up hope is an option. As the saying goes, you can either light a candle or curse the darkness. Take your pick. Lighting candles has always held a lot more appeal to me than cursing the darkness. But I really don't think that hope is the only thing that we have at this point. Even though we face a huge, super wicked problem, and as we discussed, messes, we also have some really effective tools at our disposal if we can just get our act together enough to be able to deploy them. I think one of the most important things we can do is learn from one another. That's another reason why I wanted to do these podcasts. There are lots of lessons to be communicated, and the more people that can be reached, the better.
Let's change gears a bit. You typically ask your guests a number of personal and hypothetical questions at the end of the interview. How about we ask you to answer a few of these types of questions?
Okay, that sounds fair.
So first question, what books do you most often recommend or gift to other people?
Well, it seems I am always recommending books to people. Many times it's a book I've just read and enjoyed, but I have a number of books that I also find myself recommending quite often to people who want to better understand what we're up against with climate change. There are two books that I find myself recommending as foundation books. The first is Heat by George Monbiot. I referred to this earlier in the podcast interview. This is a really important book because it does two important things. First, it lays out the history of how we came to be in this mess, and then it looks at how you would actually make changes to address carbon emissions. The second is Willful Blindness by Margaret Heffernan. Again, we just referred to her. This is also a really important book because it explains why it is so difficult for people to change their minds, even when the evidence is right in front of them. Our brains are wired to resist our changing our opinions and views on things, regardless of the facts. I think this is a must-read because it makes clear what our species is up against as we try to move forward in changing how we understand our environment and our role in it. You know, Erin, it occurs to me it might be fun to have a podcast where we talk about great books that people might want to read related to the 21st century imperative.
Second question. If you were asked to teach a course to a first-year university class, what would you do with it?
That's a great question, Erin. First-year university students are a great group to give presentations to and teach. They are very engaged and have not yet become too jaded. I think I would want to teach a course in the basics of systems theory, and I think the textbook would be Jürgen Rander's book, 2052, A Global Forecast for the Next 40 Years. By the way, that's another book I recommend people read. But to do so, I would use the workings of the biosphere as a system, as an example for exploring systems. When I was a biology student, one of the things I most enjoyed about my courses in limnology and marine biology was the complex interaction of the various parts of the systems that comprise lakes and oceans. Most importantly, it taught me that everything is connected, and in very interesting and sometimes counterintuitive ways. So this is really a great example for systems thinking. I think that a course that taught students the interconnectedness of all of the systems in our biosphere and the various feedback loops involved would give them a much better sense of understanding of the complexity and importance of climate change problems we now face.
That makes a lot of sense. Sincerely, I wish I could take that course. Okay, third question. If you could publish a full-page spread in the Sunday New York Times of anything you wanted, written or graphic, what would it look like?
Well, I think I have two possible answers. The first is that I would have a large logo of the 21st Century Imperative podcast and its URL positioned at the top of the page, and below that would be written the caption, Ideas to Inspire Action, conversations with people who are making a real difference in stepping up to meet the challenge of the 21st Century Imperative. And then, under it, would be the images of all the guests with key quotes from each guest. I know this sounds very self-promotional, but given the cause, I think it would work. The second idea would be that I would have a graph that showed a historical timeline of some of the world's most challenging problems that we thought we might not be able to solve, and then the dates on which they were actually solved. Some of the examples that immediately come to mind are the sanitary revolution, when we discovered how to keep sewage away from our water supply, something we just take for granted now, and thus pathological bacteria like typhus and cholera from infecting large parts of our population. There's a really good book by Stephen Johnson on this topic too. And then more recently, the elimination of chlorofluorocarbons, which we just talked about, and the subsequent regeneration of the hole in the ozone layer. So I think it's really worth seeing that some of the really tough problems we've faced as a species can often be solved, and even when we think it's impossible. So it would give people some hope. Come to think of it, if it were a full-page spread, I could probably have both on one page.
And just as you ask your guests at the end of the interview, do you have any requests of listeners? Anything you want them to do after listening to this podcast?
Yes, I figured you're going to ask that question. So I'd like to ask our listeners to consider the following three things. First of all, if they have not already read Heat by George Monbiot, they should put it on the top of their must-read books. Second, after they listen to any of these podcasts, ask themselves what they might be able to do to make a difference in meeting the challenge of the 21st century imperative, whether in their personal or professional lives. As Ryan Myers points out in my interview with him, I think that's podcast number 3, climate change is a beast that will have to be killed by 1,000 cuts, so everyone has to do their part to help. And third, don't give up. We are facing some pretty big challenges in the next couple of decades. so we will need all hands on deck. One of the reasons I am producing these podcasts is to provide people with both ideas and a sense that there are things we can do to make a positive difference. So just keep looking for ways to make a positive contribution and supporting others you know who are doing the same. Your contribution will be really important.
I think that that's a great note to end on. It's been a lot of fun doing this interview, and now it's time for me to get down to post-production. Thanks again for taking time to do this interview today, Craig.
Thank you, Erin. It's been a lot of fun being on the other side of the interview table, and I really appreciate you working with me to make this happen. You are a really good interviewer. Thanks again, Erin.
You can find links to more information about Craig Applegath and to notes about what we discussed in this podcast at tfcipodcast.com. And if you like this podcast, please let us know by rating it on the Apple iTunes podcast website, and please share the link with people you know who might be interested in this podcast. Until next time, thank you for listening.